When we say, "This is my choice," what do we really mean? Are we genuinely able to decide our actions freely, choosing from countless possible alternatives? Or are our thoughts and decisions already shaped, perhaps even determined by our environment, our past experiences, and even our biological mechanisms? The question of free will has troubled philosophers and scientists for centuries. It is not merely an abstract theoretical puzzle. It profoundly shapes how we understand responsibility, morality, and our own sense of self-worth. If human beings are not truly free, then do praise and blame still make sense? Can we justifiably hold people accountable for their actions? On the other hand, if we do possess free will, where exactly are its limits? In this video, I will explore the meaning and challenges of free will from a range of perspectives. Together, we will consider whether human beings genuinely have control over their choices, and reflect on whether our image of ourselves as free agents rests upon a belief that deserves closer examination. Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a cat who dreams of becoming a philosopher. This is the place where I share my thoughts and explore new ideas with you all. So, let's dive into today's topic. In philosophical debate, free will is often pushed to its limits through thought experiments, designed to test our deepest intuitions about choice and decision-making. One of the most famous examples is Newcomb's paradox. Imagine a nearly omniscient predictor, someone who can forecast your choices with astonishing accuracy. This predictor has already placed money into boxes based on what they believe you will do. You may take one box or two. However, the prediction has already been made. If the predictor foresaw that you would take only one box, that box contains a vast sum of money. If they predicted you would take both boxes, then the main box contains almost nothing. The dilemma is this: if the prediction already exists, is your choice still free? Reason seems to point in two conflicting directions. One approach emphasizes causal consistency. If the predictor is almost always correct, then you ought to trust their accuracy and take only one box. The other relies on the dominance principle. Since the contents are already fixed, taking two boxes can never leave you worse off. This split reveals something profound. Freedom is not merely about the ability to act, but about how we understand causation and the order of time. What makes Newcomb's paradox so compelling is how it blurs the line between prediction and decision. If the predictor is always right, it seems as though our choice was effectively settled in advance. Yet from our own perspective, we still experience ourselves as deciding freely in the moment. How can that subjective experience coexist with near-perfect prediction? Here we encounter the enduring tension between determinism and free will. If the state of the universe and the laws of nature are sufficient to determine everything that will happen, then is choice simply part of an inevitable chain of events? And yet, human beings continue to regard themselves as the authors of their actions, taking responsibility within moral judgment. Perhaps our understanding of freedom does not require a complete escape from causation after all. Another striking example is Kavka's Toxin puzzle. Imagine someone offers you a substantial reward on one condition. Tonight, you must genuinely intend to drink a bottle of Toxin tomorrow. The toxin is not fatal. It will merely cause severe discomfort. Crucially, you are free to change your mind tomorrow and not drink it. The reward is given purely on the basis of your intention tonight. But when tomorrow arrives, you have already received the money. There seems to be no reason to drink the toxin. So here's the puzzle. Can you truly form the intention to drink it, knowing full well that you will later decide not to? If the intention is strategically manufactured purely to obtain the reward, is it still a genuine intention? This forces us to distinguish between outward resolve and inner sincerity of motivation. Kavka's puzzle reveals how closely free will is tied to self-control. We often assume that we can form intentions through rational reflection, and then act upon them. Yet when reason itself tells us that we will later reverse our decision, intention begins to look fragile. If we cannot shape our beliefs and commitments entirely at will, perhaps freedom exists only within limits. Perhaps true freedom is not the ability to change our minds at any moment, but the capacity to align our present intentions with our deeper, long-term values. Taken together, Newcomb's paradox and Kafka's Toxin puzzle place free will at the crossroads of rationality and causation. They challenge us to ask whether freedom means breaking free from prediction and necessity, or whether it means understanding our constraints and still consciously identifying with our choices. Through these thought experiments, we begin to appreciate just how complex the problem of free will truly is, and we lay the groundwork for what follows. In responding to Newcomb's paradox and Kavka's Toxin puzzle, we might step back and reconsider them from a higher-level causal perspective. Both thought experiments rely on a shared assumption: the existence of someone capable of predicting future behavior with remarkable accuracy. Once that prediction is made, the scenario deliberately strips away the original background conditions and asks us to reassess whether we are still free now that we know the prediction exists. In other words, these puzzles create tension between freedom and determinism by isolating the prediction from the very circumstances that made it possible. Yet this way of reasoning may overlook a deeper level of causal consistency. Take Newcomb's paradox. If the predictor's accuracy depends on having sufficiently complete psychological and behavioral information about you, then the prediction itself forms part of the wider causal chain. The moment you begin to consider whether to defy the prediction, you are already altering the conditions that underpinned its reliability. If such a highly accurate predictor genuinely exists, that would imply that your patterns of thought and decision-making possess a certain stability. The idea that you could overturn the prediction at the final moment may be more a product of abstract imagination, created by isolating the scenario, than a genuine possibility within the original causal structure. From this broader viewpoint, prediction and choice are not adversaries, but different nodes within the same causal network. The same applies, perhaps even more clearly, to Kafka's Toxin puzzle. The puzzle assumes that a person can sincerely intend tonight to drink the toxin tomorrow, while also rationally knowing that tomorrow they will change their mind. By separating these two moments in time, the thought experiment treats intention and action as though they were independent. But if we consider the continuity of causation, a person who would later regret and refuse to drink the toxin already possesses a psychological structure, a set of values and priorities that includes that tendency. If the person offering the reward were a reliable judge of character, they simply would not give the money to someone disposed to back out. In that sense, the person who would ultimately refuse the toxin would never receive the reward in the first place. Conversely, if someone does receive the money, that suggests their intention at the time was sufficiently stable that they would not later reverse it. Receiving the reward and following through are not accidental pairings, but expressions of the same underlying traits and decision-making patterns. If the toxin is ultimately not consumed, we might conclude that the supposed prediction or judgment was never genuinely secure to begin with. From a higher-level causal perspective, the paradox arises because the thought experiment artificially fragments what is, in reality, a continuous psychological process. Seen in this light, these puzzles may not truly undermine free will. Rather, they remind us that freedom need not mean independence from causation. It may instead reside within a stable and intelligible causal structure. If our character traits, beliefs, and values are themselves the causes of our actions, then the existence of prediction does not automatically negate autonomy. A higher-level causal response does not evade the problem. It suggests that freedom and necessity may not be enemies after all, but capable of coexisting within the same framework. The so-called tiger paradox is a thought experiment about the tension between knowledge and prediction. In the story, a king offers a condemned prisoner a chance to escape execution, but only if he can prove that the king has lied. The king arranges 5 doors to be opened one by one. Behind one of them is a tiger. The king declares that before the fatal door is opened, the prisoner will not know which door conceals the tiger. If the prisoner can know in advance where the tiger is, then the king's statement is false, and the prisoner will be freed. The prisoner begins reasoning backwards. Starting from the fifth door, he eliminates possibilities step by step, eventually concluding that the tiger cannot be behind any of the doors at all. Yet when he opens them in order, the tiger leaps out from behind the second door. The king's claim has not been refuted, and the paradox emerges. At which step did the prisoner make a mistake? The prisoner's mistake occurs at the very first step. He treats the king's prediction about his future ignorance as though it were a premise from which he can deduce the arrangement of the doors. He assumes that if, at some future moment, only one logical possibility remains, then he must necessarily acquire certain knowledge, thereby proving the king wrong, and so he eliminates that possibility. But the king's statement does not constrain logical possibility. It concerns the prisoner's actual cognitive state. The crucial point is this: as long as the prisoner does not form a definite belief about the tiger is behind the door, the king's statement remains true. The king did not claim that the tiger could not be reasoned about. He claimed only that the prisoner would not know its location prior to opening the door. As long as the prisoner continues to deny or doubt that the tiger is definitively behind any particular door, the king has not lied. In fact, even if we reduce the scenario to a single door, the structure remains the same. Suppose there were only one door, and the tiger was behind it. As long as the prisoner does not form certain knowledge of that fact before opening it, even if he suspects or reasons abstractly, the king's claim still stands. The number of doors is irrelevant. The heart of the problem lies in epistemology, in knowledge, not in physical arrangement. This sheds light on how foreknowledge might actually operate. A prediction comes true after all those who hear it respond in the way they judge best. Foreknowledge is not an external force manipulating events from outside the system. It includes within itself how agents react to the prediction. For someone who does not believe the prediction, the foretold outcome is precisely the one that includes their disbelief. For someone who believes it, the outcome includes that belief. There is no scenario in which a disbeliever first disbelieves and then, under identical conditions, produces the result that would have occurred had they believed. Nor is there a case in which a believer, without any change in circumstances, produces the result of disbelief. Yet these imagined reversals are often invoked by critics of foreknowledge. The deeper issue is that such reversals cannot be tested. You cannot make the same choice twice under exactly the same psychological and informational conditions. The moment belief changes, the conditions themselves have changed. Since we cannot repeat the experiment with an identical mental background, the idea of disproving foreknowledge through deliberate reversal lacks genuine testability. The tiger paradox, then, is not a failure of foreknowledge. Rather, it reminds us that apparent contradictions often arise when we shift between different explanatory levels without noticing. What looks like a paradox may simply be a confusion between logical possibility and actual knowledge, between abstract reasoning and lived cognition. When we talk about free will, we often assume that a person can serve as the ultimate starting point of their actions. But the moment we press further and ask, where does free will itself come from? The issue quickly becomes more complicated. If I choose a particular course of action today because of my character and values, then how were those character traits and values formed? They emerged from my upbringing, my family environment, my culture, my education, and my past experiences. And if we continue to ask about the origins of those conditions, we are led further back to earlier causal influences, to genetic structure, even to the laws of nature themselves. Layer by layer, as we trace the chain backwards, free will no longer appears as something arising from nothing. Instead, it seems embedded within a vast causal network. This ongoing demand for explanation can be described as an infinite regress of causes. Each time we attribute a choice to the self, we can ask, how did the self come to be as it is? If free will means that our actions are not determined by prior conditions, then we must identify a source that is genuinely untouched by causation. Yet, every time we attempt to locate such a source, it seems to be explained in turn by something earlier. Even if someone claims that the will is a spontaneous force, we may still ask, why does the spontaneity arise at this particular moment rather than another? The questioning does not stop. It simply moves deeper. Following this line of reasoning, we are often led to an unsettling conclusion that free will itself arises from factors already in place. Our biological structure, our psychological tendencies, and our external circumstances all shape the choices we make. When we say, I decided to do this, what we are really describing may be the convergence of numerous conditions at a particular moment. Each of those conditions has its own prior causes, then the entire process forms a continuous and seemingly closed causal system. Free will appears to be absorbed into determinism. Some may attempt to halt the regress at a certain point, declaring that the will is the ultimate cause and needs no further explanation. Yet this move often feels like a theoretical stopping point rather than a genuine solution. If the will were entirely uncaused, how could it remain connected to our character and our rational capacities? If it were completely disconnected from prior conditions, our actions would seem random, and randomness is not the same as freedom. But if the will is connected to prior conditions, then it is influenced by them, and cannot serve as an absolute beginning. The force of the infinite regress lies in the dilemma it creates. Either we accept that free will is rooted in existing conditions, and therefore not an absolute starting point, or we posit some causally unbound source, while facing the difficulty of explaining or verifying it. This tension does not necessarily eliminate free will altogether, but it does weaken the intuitive picture of the will as an unconditioned creator. The more persistently we ask about causes, the harder it becomes to see freedom as something that stands entirely apart from what has already been determined. Let us assume that the universe has only one actual unfolding history, what we might call a single-track universe. At any given moment, the state of a world has only one possible continuation. Past conditions, together with the laws of nature, give rise to the present situation. And the present situation, in turn, leads to only one future that will actually occur. Within such a framework, it is impossible, at the same time and under exactly the same conditions, to make two different choices. However strong our subjective sense of possibility may be, in reality only one action ever takes place. Advocates of a strong notion of free will often argue that, under precisely identical conditions, a person could genuinely have chosen otherwise. Yet, under the assumption of a single-track universe, this claim becomes difficult to sustain. If the conditions were truly identical, but the outcome differed, that would mean the same set of causes could produce two mutually exclusive results. Such a view would undermine causal consistency. If we accept that the laws of nature are stable, and that the history of the world is unique, then the choice that actually occurs at a given moment is the sole result of all conditions acting together. We cannot return to that exact moment, with no differences whatsoever, and make a different decision. For this reason, we are also unable to prove that our behavior conforms to the kind of absolute free will some philosophers defend. That form of freedom is typically defined as the power to produce different outcomes under exactly the same conditions. But in a single-track universe, we cannot simultaneously test two alternative choices, nor can we step outside existing conditions to examine whether we truly could have acted differently. When we say, I could have done otherwise, it may function more as a linguistic or hypothetical expression than as a verifiable fact. This does not necessarily force us to abandon freedom altogether. Rather, it invites us to reconsider what we mean by it. If freedom no longer means generating different outcomes under identical conditions, Perhaps it can instead be understood as acting from one's own character and reasons, rather than under external coercion. On this view, freedom is not opposed to causation. It exists within it. Our actions may be shaped by past conditions, but if they arise from our beliefs, values, and rational reflection, rather than from direct external manipulation, they may still count as free. In a single-track universe, then, there may be no room for a notion of free will that stands entirely outside causation. What remains possible is a form of freedom compatible with determinism, a freedom expressed through the individual's internal structure within the existing causal network. This version of freedom does not emphasize multiple actual possibilities. Instead, it emphasizes coherence between action and self. Once we accept that the history of the universe follows a single path, freedom becomes not the power to branch off into alternatives, but the capacity to own and identify with our role along that path. If we accept determinism, the view that human behavior is embedded within an unbroken chain of causes, a pressing question immediately arises: does law still have legitimacy? If everything we do is shaped by character, environment, genetics, and past experience, can criminals truly be held responsible? At first glance, determinism seems to weaken the very idea of responsibility, and with it, the foundation of the legal system. Yet that conclusion does not necessarily follow. Within a deterministic framework, punishment is not a metaphysical act of revenge against free will. It is itself part of the causal network. Laws, the threat of penalties, and the operation of the justice system all form part of the social conditions that influence behavior. The expectation of punishment becomes one of the causes shaping future decisions. In other words, people often refrain from committing crimes precisely because they anticipate consequences. Punishment is not merely a moral declaration delivered after the fact. It is a factor already embedded in the decision-making process beforehand. For this reason, the statement, "someone committed a crime despite knowing they would be punished," is not contradictory. It simply reveals that the deterrent effect of punishment varies between individuals. Some are restrained by the fear of consequences. Others are driven by stronger motives that override that fear. These differences, too, are products of intertwined causal conditions. The design of legal systems, adjusting the severity and certainty of penalties, aims to influence the probability of certain behaviors occurring. More importantly, the public existence and enforcement of punishment shapes the wider causal environment. Trials, sentences, and legal consequences send a message to society. Certain actions will reliably bring about certain outcomes. This alters people's expectations about the future, and therefore alters their behavior. Under determinism, punishment is not meaningless retaliation. It is a mechanism for steering causal processes. It participates in shaping what happens next, rather than merely responding to what has already occurred. At the ethical level, the justification of punishment can also be reframed. Even if we abandon the idea that responsibility rests upon absolute metaphysical freedom, we can still evaluate punishment in terms of protecting society, preventing harm, and encouraging reform. Imprisonment can isolate dangerous individuals and reduce immediate risk. Education and rehabilitation can reshape future behavioral tendencies. Public judgment to stabilize social norms. None of these functions depends upon a notion of completely uncaused free will. They depend instead on an understanding of consequences. At the same time, determinism may encourage a shift in attitude. If behavior has causes, then our response to wrongdoing might emphasize understanding and reform rather than pure moral condemnation. Improving social conditions, educational systems, and psychological support becomes part of adjusting the causal chain. Law is no longer merely an instrument of punishment, but a structure designed to influence the conditions that shape future action. Under determinism, then, law and punishment do not disappear. On the contrary, their role becomes clearer. They are components within the causal network, influencing both individual and collective behavior. The ethics of punishment need not rest on retribution against absolute freedom, but on responsibility for consequences and the deliberate shaping of the future. Our exploration of free will, from philosophical paradoxes to causal chains and finally to law and punishment, reveals a clear and coherent line of reasoning. Through the tiger paradox and the discussion of foreknowledge, we saw that what we call free will is often constrained by the structures of knowledge and prediction. Through the problem of infinite regress and the idea of a single-track universe, we recognize that the conditions behind our actions stretch far back into the past, shaping what eventually occurs. And even within determinism, we found that law and punishment retain both ethical meaning and practical value. Taken together, these reflections suggest that freedom is not the total absence of causation. Rather, it may be the capacity to act within causation, to make choices that arise from our own reasoning, values, and sense of identity, even though those elements themselves are part of a broader causal network. Freedom, in this sense, is not about standing outside the universe and breaking its laws. It is about recognizing our place within the unfolding order of events and taking ownership of the role we play. Responsibility, likewise, need not depend on absolute independence from all prior causes. It can instead rest on the connection between action and character, between what we do and who we are. Understanding this allows us to redefine freedom, responsibility, and ethics in more grounded and realistic terms. Rather than seeing freedom and causation as enemies, we may come to view them as intertwined, two aspects of the same human condition. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye!